Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining this IISS panel discussion on the issue of Iran's nuclear program, a surge into modernity. Thank you all for adjusting your schedules to come 30 minutes earlier than we had originally advertised. We changed the time to accommodate those who also want to go to a 1 p.m. presentation at another institute in town by the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Yukiya Amano. But I think not everybody got the word that it was changed, so we will have some people be coming in, and don't give them dirty looks because it's not their fault that they didn't check the email and got the news. But let me not filibuster too much longer. I'd like to turn to our speakers to hear their thoughts. First of all, David Patrikarakos will be talking about some of the themes that are in the book that he has just published on Iran's nuclear program and what it means for Iranians. I'm very familiar with David's book because I had the pleasure of being a peer reviewer for it, so I saw it in an earlier stage, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in the final stage. But I thought it was a fascinating insight with most of it very new information, talking with people who had been involved in the Iranian program directly from years back. After David gives an initial presentation, we'll turn to a friend of his and now a new friend of mine, Siavush Randjbar-Daemi, who will offer a commentary based partly on another book that recently has been published, but I'll let him speak to that. So, David, if you could get us kicked off.
For the last decade, the West's leading powers in Iran have engaged in the most sustained diplomatic clash since the build-up to the Iraq War in 2003, and it is escalating. Almost exactly 10 years on from August 2002, when an Iranian opposition group, the MKO, revealed full details of a uranium enrichment plant at Natanz and heavy water facility at Iraq, the P5 has now managed to sanction Iran's oil, isolate the country from the international banking system, and make it an international pariah. Talk of military action against Iran is ever present. Iran, meanwhile, has managed to enrich uranium to around 20%, which involves most of the expertise required for it to get to weapons-grade levels, about 80%. It runs several thousand centrifuges and has a large stockpile of low-enriched uranium, from which it could conceivably manufacture a nuclear bomb. We are at a crisis, more than 30 years after the coming of the Islamic Republic, and 10 years into the nuclear crisis. The question of how to integrate into the international community a country of 70 million people and amongst the largest reserves of oil and gas in the world still remains. Now, this talk may be slightly different to many you've heard on the subject. I'm not going to discuss whether Iran's building a bomb or how close it is to one. I won't discuss sanctions, centrifuges, or enrichment, though we can certainly talk about this in the Q&A. Rather, I'm going to discuss the program as a whole, and by that I mean a civil program and any possible weapons program, and to try to show what the program in itself means and has meant to Iran at different periods of its history, why it's meant this, and how its meaning has changed over time, and crucially why. Only by understanding this, I argue, is there hope of resolving the current crisis. And I'm going to advance a very simple thesis. The nuclear program offers an opportunity. It is a window into the enigma of modern Iran, the story of which is in several regards the story of Iran's efforts to engage with a specific view of the modern world as deeply hostile and to negotiate a place within it. Iran's program is merely the most ambitious attempt for it to do this. I argue that the program's story, its history, is a kind of tabula rasa onto which the history of modern Iran has been and continues to be written. Understand the nuclear program and you understand modern Iran. Understand modern Iran and you have the best chance of solving the nuclear crisis. The roots of the Iranian program lie not in physics but in Iranian history, which, as I said, has created a very specific view of the world. Since the beginning of the 19th century, Iran has suffered the loss of territories, part of Azerbaijan in 1812, the division of its own country into spheres of influence by the British and Russians in 1907, and even the forced abdication of its rulers, that, moreover, were put there by foreigners in the first place, Reza Shah in 1941. Even without the trauma of a sustained occupation, this meddling has amounted to a colonization of internal Iranian politics that found an inevitable apotheosis, if you like, with the 1953 overthrow of the democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. This event has remained lodged in the Iranian consciousness ever since. All these experiences have created an underlying national narrative that Iran is a weak country that must do what it can to protect itself against stronger, more aggressive ones, to achieve some kind of independence or autonomy or greater freedom of action in a Western-dominated world that is culturally alien and historically hostile. For many Iranians, the country's oil wealth, its geostrategic location will always make it a target for others. How Iran has sought to deal with this, or more accurately, how its ruling elites have sought to deal with this question, has driven the nuclear program, often in totally antithetical directions, for over 50 years. So, to begin briefly at the beginning, nuclear power came to Iran in the 1950s under a bilateral agreement with the US during the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's rule. I don't intend to dwell on the Shah's program, but it makes a good counterpoint to the Islamic Republic, which I'll discuss at greater length. Suffice to say that no one had a more visceral understanding of Iran's weakness in the face of quote-unquote foreigners than Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had come to power during the 1941 Anglo invasion of Iran, and who had only been allowed to take the throne when the British and Russians had forced his father to flee into exile. No one desired national autonomy, national independence more than him, and a nuclear program, which was something critically he wanted personally, was for him a means to this end. Iran was a developing country, is a developing country, but at the time it had a ruler who wanted to restore it to its former glory, its imperial glory, for it to become critically the equal of his Western role models. Nuclear programs, as projects of great sophistication, can bring a lot of prestige to developing countries. The benefits they bring, technological improvement, increased national capability, nuclear-powered electric grids, etc., can be very attractive, offering the chance to plug what I term a prestige deficit they often feel in relation to the West, something the Shah felt keenly. So for the Shah, his nuclear program was how, along with his lavish imperial posturing, his grandiose parties, his highly sophisticated army, it was how Iran would find autonomy, how it would find self-respect and pride in the world. It was the ultimate hyper project through which to display national capability. His man to the moon, if you like. And as it was seen as the ultimate in technology, it was therefore the ultimate conduit to modernization, to modernity itself. But it's what modernization or modernity meant to the Shah that's very important, and was very important for the nuclear program in terms of how it was constructed, in terms of the contractors it employed. Modernity meant one thing above all else, that Iran was like the West. For the Shah, modernization was a westernization. He even actually, in a book he wrote, Mission for My Country, in which he outlined his royal mandate for Iran, he entitled the chapter, Westernization, Our Welcome Ordeal. And at every single stage of the Republic, the Shah's program, it is this overarching impulse that is at the center. The Germans and the French were taken on. He even, to build the nuclear facilities, he even sacrificed indigenous capability to try and bind Iran to the West through the forging of commercial ties. It wasn't a hugely practical vision, and in the end it contracted and crumbled like the rest of his reign. And towards the end it became one more hyper project that could be used as a stick with which to beat the Shah, and was one more unpopular move that contributed to his downfall. So during the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah and replaced him with the Ayatollah Khomeini, it was a very, very different Iran. Crowds walked through the streets carrying banners of Mossadegh, denouncing the Shah as a Western lapdog and chanting Magbar-Amerika, death to America. The coup, already iconic in the national consciousness, was reduced to a simple homily about the perfidious role of the West in Iran. Westernization was no longer a goal. Now this had very serious repercussions for the nuclear program. Iran's ticket of membership to the Western Club, with its nuclear facilities being built largely, as I said, by Germans and French, it was now an anathema. Khomeini saw the world as fundamentally hostile, enthralled to the quote-unquote imperial powers that ran it. He was determined that Iran would be neither dependent on godless East nor tyrannic, blasphemous West, which meant that within months, almost all nuclear projects were unilaterally cancelled. The nuclear program, he declared, was a cause of great dependence on imperialist countries. It was, in effect, the continuation of colonialism by other means. Iran would now be self-sufficient, an imperative that was subsequently enshrined in the Islamic Republic's constitution. By rejecting the nuclear program, the revolutionary government rejected embodiment of Pavlovian ambition. It rejected, in essence, a particular form of state identity. Now, the Islamic Republic being what it is, the situation was soon reversed. Everything was very chaotic in the early years, and about a year later, in 1980, it was decided that given the sheer amount of money that the Shah had spent on the program, not to mention its possible military applications with the war with Iraq kicking off, and indeed as a means of modernization, not this time though, not westernization, logic dictated that the program should be restarted. But unfortunately, the Islamic Republic now had problems. The disgraceful kidnapping of US diplomats during 1979-1980 by an Iranian student group meant that Iran had alienated the entire world. Finding nuclear partners was difficult. The French and Germans it had cancelled its contracts with, and were now refusing, the Germans were now refusing to work on the program while the war raged. The US did everything it could as well to stop Iran getting nuclear technology and pressured its allies to do the same. It was now extremely worried that the Islamic Republic rather, might try and make a bomb. Iran in turn railed against the great Satan in every opportunity, and as far as the mullahs were concerned now, Iran was alone, and this is very important. Historical narrative was confirmed by experience. Iran was alone fighting the war against Iraq, where Iraq had used chemical weapons while in its eyes the world sat silently on. It was alone with its nuclear program. No one would help it. And the narrative had been confirmed by experience, and the lesson was clear. Iran can trust only Iran. Which meant something very strange for the nuclear program. What was once an anathema slowly morphed into a patriotic duty, as senior officials like Ali Akbar Rafsanjani began to urge nuclear scientists who had fled during the revolution to come back to do their duty and serve Iran at this difficult time. See, for the Shah, the nuclear program had been a symbol of an Iran that was Western and inclusive, plugged into the international community. But now it had become a symbol of an entirely different Iran, an Iran that was palpably non-Western and defiant. Its meaning to the state had flipped 180 degrees, but the impulse behind it, as an overt expression of how Iran would negotiate the modern world and deal with it, was exactly the same. The Shah had sought greater independence in the world through his desire to embrace the international community as represented powers, as a similar kind of state. The Islamic Republic, with its view of the world as essentially hostile, considered it a means of forcing the West to accept its self-declared otherness, but on an equal footing. Senior regime officials now boasted about the nuclear program. Despite the efforts of the Zionists and their great Satan allies, we have made great strides in our nuclear program. All lies, of course, they weren't doing anything. Senior mullahs now referred to a program as Iran's right. Like the soldiers fighting on the Iraqi battlefields, the nuclear program was symbolic of a nation's refusal to be beaten. Indeed, that must not be beaten if disaster was to be averted. And it is this idea that has been at the center of the program ever since, and that dominates Iran's modern nuclear diplomacy. So if we fast forward almost 20 years to spring 2008, 8 or so months after the MKO revealed full details of the two sites to kick off the nuclear crisis. Now, this was the mid-months of 2003, and the Iranians were scared. They'd fought a war of words over their program for 20 years, only to have Tel Aviv and Washington seemingly proved right, before a global audience, no less. The Bush administration had just made good on its threats against one member of the Axis of Evil and smashed Iraq. This was before the disaster of the peace. With Iran's dossier now at the IAEA, as it was, it could well go to the Security Council, and from there the inevitable follow. The Americans, Europeans, and the IAEA in those early months or mid-months of 2003 wanted answers from Iran. The Iranians had to formulate a position, do so quickly, and ensure it was effective. And this is where they set out the principles that guide Iran's modern nuclear diplomacy, principles that are forged in Iranian history, the early experience of the Islamic Republic, and Khomeini's worldview. Hassan Rouhani, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, was given the task of heading Iran's nuclear file in those early months of 2003. Most immediately, he had to decide if they were to defend the program, as opposed to, say, scrap it, like as Libya would subsequently do, what exactly would they be defending? What did and does the nuclear program mean to Iran almost 60 years after nuclear power first came to the country? Certain fundamental principles he decided would frame all policy, preeminent of which was the prima facie belief that the nuclear program was integral to Iran's security. It would not be abandoned. As ever, policy was framed by Iranian perceptions of history, namely the overarching problem between Iran and the West. As Rouhani told its president, Mohammad Khatami, the authority of the Islamic regime its national security and the unification of all its territories have not at any time during these past 27 years been supported or even recognized by the West in any realistic manner. The determination of this great nation to ensure its stability and to seek independence and justice has never been and never will be welcomed by the West. At no stage after the victory of the Islamic Revolution has the relationship between Iran and the West become normalized. The Islamic Republic, it believed, lived in a world where no one would even accept its very existence. In its eyes, a nuclear program was a symptom of this. Its nuclear program was a symptom of this. It had been targeted, as far as it was concerned, by the US and Europe from the beginning, who abrogated contracts to cheat Iran out of technology that it had promised and money and everything else, just to keep it down in the best traditions of Western imperialism. The Busheshra nuclear power plant in particular highlighted this trend. Under 3 consecutive US presidents, Rouhani argued to Khatami, prevention of its construction, quote-unquote, dominated Russian-American relations. What this meant, Rouhani argued, was that there was no other option for Iran but to produce this nuclear technology within its own borders. As he said, the clash between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Western world will never be resolved until Iran's ability in various political, economic, scientific, and technological arenas reaches an equal comparable to that of the West, and a just relationship between us and them becomes inevitable. This belief in Iran's need to face the position from a world of strength drives modern nuclear diplomacy. And if the situation was then dangerous, it only made the need for strength more critical, from which the achievement, as you now see, what was necessary was the achievement of an indigenous fuel cycle. It had to be created from within its own borders. To compromise would be to compromise on the regime's existence, which was self-evidently unacceptable. Even when Iran suspended uranium enrichment for 2 years between 2003 and 2005, efforts were made to push on with all other nuclear activities. Facts needed to be created on the ground. In 2005, when Rouhani signed off from his position as head of the nuclear file, his nuclear policy, he argued, had been vindicated. In the last 6 years, the valuable work of the National Atomic Agency, as well as the genius and efforts of the country's scientists, have gradually reached a level that has forced the world to believe in Iran's nuclear capabilities. Today, Iran is the possessor of indigenous nuclear technology that derives its existence from its people and belongs to the people. And because it is indigenous, it can never be taken away. For the Shah, the world really was a stage, and its international institutions an opportunity for him to play upon it. The Islamic Republic, conversely, views the world as hostile, and many hardliners argue for a security policy based on the most atavistic elements of Khomeini's worldview, all of which you've seen in the previous 3 quotations. And if the world was unfriendly in 1953, they believe it's far worse now. The US, they argue, wants to overthrow the regime, and since the first Gulf War in 1991 has had a huge presence in the Middle East, with military bases in Saudi Arabia at times and the UAE, not to mention the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, all within easy striking distance. 2001's Operation Enduring Freedom saw huge numbers of American troops gathered on Iran's eastern border in Afghanistan, while Saddam's overthrow, while it removed a pressing security threat, saw more US troops massed now on its western border. With US forces also in the CIS republics, notably Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, Iran has been encircled by the USA on its own continent. There is a bitter joke that's done the rounds in Tehran for many years that I heard the last time I was there. There are only 2 countries in the world that have only the USA as their border. The other is Canada. The Iranians are scared, and they want respect. They feel the world has not accorded them their due. As Iran's ambassador to the IAEA, Ali Asghar Soltanei, told me a few years ago in Vienna, "We are a nation with 5,000 years of history. The West should not speak to us like animals." The nuclear program is a symptom of these impulses. A civil nuclear program brings a developing country like Iran a prestige to which it is keenly sensitive. It is a shortcut to a much-desired modernity and to technological advancement. A nuclear bomb may give the country the security it craves. Precedent is important here. Following the 9/11 attacks, the US invaded Afghanistan to destroy the Taliban, a regime that had harbored and supported al-Qaeda. But Islamabad had also harbored and supported al-Qaeda, was a long-standing supporter of terrorism, was a dictatorship with a dismal human rights record, and had also spawned the AQ Khan network. Despite all its help in Afghanistan, Iran was declared a member of the Axis of Evil, while Secretary of State Colin Powell described Pakistan as a major ally in the global war on terror. Washington then went, of course, to smash an Iraq that turned out not to have WMDs. Many in Tehran concluded that the White House treats nuclear states differently. And then, of course, when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear arsenal and some years later was overthrown, this further cemented the idea of strength, security, and nuclear weapons in the eyes of many. And it is all of these fears and neuroses and anxieties that are at the heart of today's impasse. The nuclear crisis is not the cause, but the effect of a wider clash between Iran and the West. And it is this underlying relationship that must be addressed for any resolution to be found. As long as the P5+1 continues to dance with Iran without tackling the problems inherent in the central relationship, and I must add, it's not entirely their fault. Iran has often been more interested in stalling and wasting time than negotiating. But as long as this central relationship is not tackled, a lasting diplomatic solution is impossible. Sanctions may yet force Iran to compromise on uranium enrichment in the short term. A nuclear strike could delay the program in the short term, but they will not fix the Iran problem. Only by broadening out the scope of engagement can this be achieved. Engaging Iran on regional affairs, involving in multilateral discussions and forums, and attempting to alleviate its fears and neuroses, which are manifold and manifest. This is the only way the relationship can be fixed. Iran now possesses enough low-enriched uranium to make several bombs, and while it couldn't enrich to the necessary levels without throwing out the IAEA inspectors, the prospect of a bomb is there. This is critical, because unless there is a breakthrough, the world may one day have to deal with the unpleasant prospect of a nuclear-capable Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We'll maybe save the clapping to the end. This was, I think, a very well-presented thesis. And along the way, I found myself wanting to challenge it, but each time you came back and you explained it in ways that were coherent. I want to apologize to the people who have come in late that didn't get the memo that we had advanced the time of this meeting. There are some seats toward the front if you would like to come up. And I would like to ask Dr. Siavush Randjbar-Daemi to offer a commentary of his on the topic. Siavush is a lecturer in contemporary Middle East and Iran at the University of Manchester, a post he took up just last month. We're happy to have you in the United Kingdom. Siavush is, in addition to being an academic, a budding author and a journalist himself. He's written about Iran for Italian newspapers. But he's done his schooling in the United Kingdom. So, Siavush, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, David, for this excellent overview on the Iranian nuclear program. I will make some points which will sort of augment what David has said without trying to overlap him. And as a political historian who does not focus specifically on the nuclear program, I'm more interested to see what the effects of long-term projects undertaken by the Islamic Republic, such as, of course, the nuclear program, is on the domestic configuration of political forces in Iran. So I was very happy, and I think many other of my colleagues were very happy, when Hassan Rouhani, who, of course, David introduced, decided to air his views on the nuclear program last autumn in a 1,000-page book. I have to confess that I haven't read fully all of it yet, and because it's quite an undertaking, but I have taken some information out of the book which I think is interesting in understanding how the debate and the discussion on the nuclear program evolved within the Iranian political elite. And Rouhani starts his book in 1979 in Paris. As David said, the nuclear program was shunned by the new Islamic Republic. It was shunned because it was seen as in a way, an element of colonialism through other means. In Paris, some of the students who resided abroad were a member of the Confederation of Iranian Students who had gone to see Khomeini in his exile in Paris, told him that the program would be a continuation of dependency from the West. This was highlighted by the Tehran press in the first few months after the revolution. In around July of 1979, the important daily Ayan Degan, which was the first daily to be banned by the Islamic Republic, came out with a long dossier on the on the existing nuclear program, and its bottom line was that it was, in Persian, edameh vabastagi, or simply the continuation of dependency. And it made the point that Bushehr would never be finished by Iranians. It was impossible to have it finished. So the nuclear program, discussions on the contemporary shape of what we see today as the Iranian nuclear program started in earnest in 1987 when Hossein Mousavi, who you know for other reasons, was prime minister of Iran, and Khomeini obviously was still alive. And according to Rouhani, the discussions started at that point over the enriching of uranium. And again, as David quite rightly pointed out, the idea was that the West or any other external country would probably hold up the supply of enriched uranium, would not supply it in regular intervals. So discussions were made to equip Iran with the capacity to produce uranium. And this was already in 1987. However, discussions during Mousavi's time were largely at the speculative level. There were discussions, talks about things to do in the future. And of course, the country was still fighting a war at the time, and it wasn't feasible to pick up the nuclear program again for geographical, economic, and many other reasons. However, it was also envisaged that because uranium enrichment was a complex procedure, the Tehran research reactor, which today, of course, we all know as operating, I think, at 19.5% enrichment, had to be toned down. At that point, Iran either envisaged or it was operating, Rouhani is not clear on this, at 93% enrichment. And, but the decision was made to scale it down to the present level, I think, which is 19.5. So it was during Rafsanjani, President Rafsanjani's tenure, as David said, that things really picked up. And the Iranian nuclear program was resurrected for a variety of reasons. The reasons listed are the longevity of this type of power station. They thought that they could get at least 50 years worth of service out of them. Their expectation that the next few decades the country would run out of oil reserves. And the fact that they thought that the Shah's government had spent a lot of money and resources on bringing up Bushehr, and they had to finish it. It was a national embarrassment to just have it rot. And also the fact that they really wanted to lessen the consumption of fossil fuels within society. Because whatever oil they had, they wanted to export, obviously, and have oil revenues. So they saw it as unnecessary to spend all this fossil fuels within the country. So things picked up in Rafsanjani's period. However, they picked up gradually. Rafsanjani made a famous trip to Moscow in 1989, between the period in which he was Majlis Speaker and he became president. And in those communications he had with Gorbachev, surprisingly, they didn't actually talk about handing Bushehr over to the Russians. And in fact, Russia was not the first choice for Iran. What Rouhani says is that they tried long and hard to get the Europeans on board. And he singles out Spain, which was curious for me, as a country which Iran tried long to persuade to pick up the construction of Bushehr again. Then they had to go with the only two countries which had some interest in taking on Bushehr. These were Russia and China. China was eventually ruled out because they thought that China simply did not have the adequate technology. It could produce reactors up to a level of 300 megawatts, and it was seen as insufficient for Bushehr. So, so China was ruled out, and eventually they went for Russia. And there were a lot of misgivings within the Iranian nuclear organization over assigning the project to Russia. And Rouhani cryptically says that switching from Western to Eastern systems was seen as costly. However, this is what happened, of course, and Bushehr was awarded to Russia after the failure of getting the Europeans on board. So both in reactor construction and uranium enrichment, the pattern which you see emerging is Iran always looking to the Europeans, pretty much as it does for example, oil exploration, as the first preferred partner, and the Europeans balking out and then resorting to other countries. The uranium enrichment part is quite interesting because Iran wanted to buy a few centrifuges to replicate, to engage in industrial reverse engineering and replicate. However, these, they first tried to buy them legitimately and openly from the Pakistani government, but Benazir Bhutto's cabinet refused quite a few times. And then eventually they started to negotiate with the Germans, and he says that the Germans, a German company refused to provide them directly, but redirected them to a Swiss intermediary who eventually redirected them to somebody else. And I think this is where Abdul Qadir Khan at some point comes into the framework. But eventually he claims that the first centrifuges that Iran obtained were actually purchased in Dubai. And those of you familiar with Iran's economy know that everything pretty much Iran imports comes from Dubai. So, you know, anything from iPhones to uranium centrifuges at one point or the other transited to Dubai. And that's the way they entered the country. They simply entered, you know, as any other good would do through Dubai. Again, so you see, part of the problem now is that, you know, we can talk now with the benefit of hindsight, but what would have happened if the Europeans had been more receptive to these Iranian attempts to get their nuclear program going and would have supplied what Iran wanted at the time? Well, things could have been probably a bit different, because if the Europeans had sort of agreed to Iran's requests from the beginning, they would have had a foothold in the Iranian nuclear program, at least at the reactor level. They would have had, you know, their own people on the ground in Bushehr instead of the Russian engineers, and more. So this lack of European interest in fronting Iran's requests, you know, led to eventually Iran nativizing its, if you allow the term, its nuclear program, according to Rouhani. And then skipping forward, because I don't want to take too much of the time here, Natanz. Natanz is an interesting case, because the way Rouhani frames it, and you know, he admits that obviously the MKO, in my view, probably not by itself, leaked the information, but he says that the reason why Iran did not disclose what was going on in Najaf is quite interesting. First of all, he blames the Iranian Atomic Energy Agency for not having an understanding of the legalities of the process. They simply did not know how they had to report what was going on in Natanz to the agency in Vienna. And that's why Iran was caught out. That's one of the reasons. The other reason, which is quite curious, is that he says that, you know, the National Security Council, which was his body, which wasn't obviously scientific council, approached a whole range of people within the country, physics professors, former members of the Atomic Energy Council, even the former head, Reza Amrullahi. And they kept asking them whether really Iran can achieve success at the UCF Esfahan plant and at Natanz, whether they're really capable of producing enriched uranium. And everybody had a very negative view. They simply thought that it was not possible, it was grandstanding, it was posturing, and Iran simply did not have the technical ability to go through with the production of uranium enrichment. And he makes the point that in the Iranian year 1381, which, if I'm not wrong, is 2002, shortly before the disclosure of Natanz, Iran had just produced a few grams of enriched uranium, nothing more. So between the fact that they simply did not trust their own scientists and they did not believe that they could actually pull it through, and the fact that the Atomic Energy Agency at the time had absolutely no idea of the legalities of the atomic of reporting, of what had to be reported to Vienna, they were caught out. And the MKO managed to come into the limelight and portray, and stake the claim that it had actually discovered serious infringements of the NPT and other nuclear agreements by Iran. And if you look at the evolution of the debate on the Iranian nuclear program after that date, it's a debate which is often fraught by the insecurity of the various Iranian political actors regarding the nuclear program. At many instances, you see that they are not really sure of what to do with it. One example was in 2006. I was in Tehran at the Strategic Research Center, and there was an important conference with all sorts of important Iranian leaders. At some point, former President Rafsanjani comes, and in the middle of his speech says that "Felan niyaz be silah hastei nadarim," which means we, at the present, at the moment, we don't need nuclear weapons. And as soon as the speech was over, his office started calling all the news agencies in Tehran, especially international ones such as the Associated Press or Reuters, claiming that it was a mistake. He didn't actually mean nuclear weapons. He just wanted to say that Iran is not producing nuclear weapons. And of course, they were about to put out the news that Rafsanjani says that in the future Iran could actually use nuclear weapons. Or in the 2009 elections debates, it was quite interesting. Again, I was at another press conference, and Karoubi, the reformist candidate, was asked about the nuclear program, and his deputy was handling all the tricky questions. The former mayor of Tehran, Gholam Hossein Karbakhchi, said that our emphasis is not on uranium. We don't want uranium enrichment. We can supply that from abroad. Our emphasis is building these reactors and getting these reactors going. And we are not really interested in enriching uranium. And this was also quite interesting because I actually did not hear this sort of remark from any other of the campaign teams, even the Mousavi team. So there's an ongoing debate. Books such as Rouhani's book, which is, in my view, a quite interesting window on the way the decision-making has been going on in the Islamic Republic, is stoking up debate. The media more or less still debates the direction of the Iranian nuclear program, but I think that even as we are talking right now, Ayhan Degan's original article in 1979 is not still fully disproved because the dependency they talk about, i.e. the fact that Iran will have a set of reactors which are completely independent of foreign collaboration and are up and running is still not yet fulfilled. And forgive me if I'm wrong, but I don't recall seeing news of the Bushehr reactor being fully operative at the time of the speech. So this was just to give you an idea of some of the key points in the evolution of the sort of decision-making and discussion within the Islamic Republic. And I think that this, as Rouhani said in 2005, and I'll conclude now, this is first and foremost a political confrontation. And he said in a speech that moving from 5% to 95% uranium enrichment, the biggest hurdle to doing so is the political one. It's not the technical one. So much depends on whether in the near future Iran will have again a team of negotiators who will understand the necessity of scaling back the diplomatic confrontation, the political confrontation, and foregoing some of the tracks along which the Iranian nuclear program has progressed, such as, of course, this emphasis on uranium enrichment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siavush. Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting, David, that you started your presentation saying that you would be talking about the Iranian program in both its civilian and its nuclear hedging aspect. Yeah. And you talked of what Rouhani had come up with as the narrative in terms of a national security logic. Whereas Siavush, you quoted Rouhani mostly in terms of his justification for the program in terms of its civilian nuclear energy aspects. And, I see a kind of a contradiction here that maybe we could get into in the discussion. But David, let me just start off with the chairman's prerogative of asking this question. In your reading from the beginning, whether the beginning is the Shah's period or the mid-1980s when the program was revived, this national security hedging strategy, the desire to have an option to go for nuclear weapons, did you think that was part of it from the beginning?
Well, I mean, if you look at the beginning under the Shah, then, I mean, it's quite clear it was discussed at the highest levels between the Shah and Akbar-e-Temad, who founded the Atomic Energy Agency of Iran in 1974. And, weapons were certainly discussed, and they were finally ruled against. But with the caveat that if anything changed in the region, Iran would certainly go for it. At the time, in the 70s, the Shah was by far the sort of most powerful military power in the Gulf. He bought huge amounts of armaments from the US, and nuclear weapons were thought that in this sort of mini polar world, he was a sort of superpower, and that actually the introduction of nuclear weapons might utilize this. Things get slightly murky with the Islamic Republic. Its decision to sort of illicitly acquire uranium enrichment technology during the mid-80s at the height of a war with Iraq does beg certain questions. Why uranium enrichment? Certainly wasn't hugely necessary at the moment and fairly expensive. So I think it has always been slightly murky. I still don't think that to this day the Islamic Republic has decided it definitely wants a bomb. I think what it's trying to do is advance as far as it can to get as close to the capability. So it's always been slightly blurred. And the one thing about the nuclear program, and the modern Iranian state is, it's hugely chaotic. As it was started up. It was started in the 50s. Then nothing happened for 20 years until 1974, when the oil boom allowed the Shah the money to invest in nuclear power. It was then cancelled, it was then restarted, and Iranian decision-making is at best opaque and chaotic. So the idea that it's one linear program that's had fixed goals throughout is certainly not true.
Thank you, thank you. Let's turn to some questions. If you could identify yourself, even if I say your name, if you could repeat it, and because I might get it wrong, and then say who you are. We'll start with Nazanin, and then Shariat in the front here, and then we'll go to Danielle in the fifth row.
Thank you very much, Nazanin Ansari, Kayhan, London. You talk about a surge into modernity as far as the Iran's nuclear program is concerned, and compare it to present day's regime's search for modernity with that of the Shah. But may I just point out that the modernity that the Shah was after was also for rights, and that is for women's rights, for education, modernity in the sense of social rights, sure, and not only scientific.
Of course.
As far as within the research you were doing, did you ever come across the prioritization of the regime as far as its nuclear program is concerned compared to its oil and gas program? Because every reactor costs at least $1 billion. Sure. So, I mean, this amount of money being invested in all of these reactors, instead of being invested where it is needed, there's a convergence of, is there a convergence? Is there, do you agree that they're putting it aside for some time else? Why do you think there is this basic contradiction between the oil and gas and then nuclear as far as their own priorities are concerned?
You might take a couple questions. I think what we'll do is we'll take a couple of comments and questions, and then we'll turn to David and Siavush. So Shariat Ahi, and then after that in the fifth row.
Shariat Ahi, Union for Democracy in Iran. David, you said to solve the problem, you have to look at the backdrop of anxiety, geostrategic anxiety with historical reasons, and you explain where they came from. But you left out one factor, and that's the Islamic nature of the regime. The geostrategic anxieties of the past do not explain why Iran is the only country out of 193 members of the United Nations that formally rejects the two-state solution, that out-Palestinians, out-Palestinians to the extent that the Palestinian Authority objects to them. Don't you think that a bit of this anxiety is self-inflicted because of that ideology, and therefore it would not simply go away by pampering Iran and involving it in regional cooperation any more than the very nature of the totalitarian state could go away?
Why don't we answer those two comments and questions right now, and then we'll go to the next two, because there's two people in about the fifth row there that want to speak. So Nazanin's question about the prioritization and the vast expense of the program, Siavush, if you would like to also answer, but David, why don't you, and then Shariat's question.
Of course. So sorry, let me get this clear. You're asking why they're spending so much money on nuclear power when oil and gas...
When they're thinking about priorities of how to advance, how to make themselves more stable
Yeah,
than themselves.
yeah.
Isn't it, how do they justify putting all of this money in nuclear when it's needed somewhere else?
Yeah, totally. Look, I mean, under the Shah, it was given huge priority, for example. I mean, they didn't even have to account to Parliament for a budget. I mean, it was very much, his pet project because it was, seen. But now, I mean, well, I think possibly there might be military applications that it's being used for, to be quite honest. Plus, there is, there is a genuine economic case for nuclear power. The Shah said every barrel of oil sold is every barrel of oil for electricity is not sold for foreign exchange earnings. So there is a legitimate case for it. But I would say that it pursues it for a variety of reasons. It's been pursuing it for so long. There is a certain amount of bloody-mindedness, which I really do think exists. And I do think that, there is this belief that there's possible military applications. That's why I think it's prioritized.
And do you have any comment to Shariat's
Yeah, look, I mean,
question?
yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm no fan of the Islamic Republic of Iran, believe me. And I do think that what you say is correct. But, for all its flaws, this is not a regime that wants to be a pariah. It's not North Korea. And I do believe that Iran, the Islamic Republic, wants more engagement, not less. I mean, they tell me this all the time when I speak to people, and you can get a sense that it's true. And I do think that, you know, they're looking for more engagement, and I do think that you can speak to them. I do think that they are rational. I don't think they're pleasant at all. You know, I'm not defending the Islamic Republic. Please, let's not have that. That was the last thing I'd want to do. But I do believe you can talk to them. I do believe that, you know, diplomacy can work. I don't think we're at the stage where it's just military strikes. I believe that with robust sanctions and diplomacy, you can make them listen to reason. I do.
And you were shaking your head affirmatively when Shari said, isn't some of the anxiety self-inflicted?
Of course. Yeah, of course. Half of everything it does is self-inflicted. I mean, you know, the hostage crisis in 1979-80 is a classic example. It alienated the world and then wondered why, you know, no one would deal with it. It was totally self-inflicted. Absolutely.
Siavush?
A couple of points on Nazanin's question. I think, first of all, it's important to note that science plays an important role here. A key component of the Islamic Republic's political elite are composed of scientists, engineers. The engineer Mousavi is the famous example of them. So they see this as a scientific landmark. They don't look at the economic side of it. They look at the scientific side of it. So this is one layer. The other layer is those who want an oil nationalization episode for the Islamic Republic. I think they don't look at the economics of it because the oil nationalization did not make economic sense, especially after Iran had a 50-50 potential deal under Mossadegh. But they see it as the moment of national triumph. And unfortunately, there's not enough time to go into it here, but I urge you to also look at the complicated ways to which the Islamic Republic can actually lean upon nationalism. Nationalism is a double-edged sword for the Islamic Republic, and it has very few ways to stoke it up. I think the nuclear program is one of these, and this is why it doggedly sticks to it despite all the cases you can make against it, with some of which you disagree.
Thank you. Let's take the two questions in the fifth row, and then in the back for the third. Is it Dr. Ganji? Actually, I would like the.
My name is
Nisa. Excuse
Hello?
me. So, I called on first of all the woman to your left. If you could be next, please.
Okay.
Hi, Danielle Loesch, a member of the Institute. I just had a quick question. You painted, David, the narrative of, I guess, the U.S.-Iranian relations or Western relations more broadly as one of kind of misunderstanding and miscalculation and a sense of kind of perhaps strategic anxiety. But, I mean, I guess at the beginning of the Obama administration in particular, there were efforts to engage the regime. And, you know, I think the things that stand to me are the kind of failed fuel swap, et cetera. What do you see going forward, especially now given the kind of current environment in the region, as ways to kind of build confidence? What are kind of concrete measures that both sides can take to potentially, I guess, perhaps fix this relationship?
You want to hold on that, and we'll ask the gentleman here. Yes, sir.
My name is Nisar Shah. I'm a journalist by profession. Does the West, along with Israel, believe that Iran has got the right to exist? Presumably, the answer will be yes. If the answer is yes, then does Iran has the right to defend itself by whatever means possible? If Israel, Pakistan, India, China, alongside can have nuclear weapons, why cannot Iran have nuclear weapon to defend itself against the terrorist Israel country in the Middle East? Thank you very much.
And then, is it Dr. Ganji in the back, please?
Thank you. Babak Ganji, Institute for Statecraft. First of all, I'm sorry to say that your entire thesis regarding the comparison between the Shah's nuclear program and the Islamic Republics is actually incorrect. Because the documentary record just simply doesn't bear out what you were saying earlier on. There was a major confrontation, as you allude to it in your own book, on the Iranian nuclear program between the United States and Iran under the Shah regarding the nuclear program. And in fact, the confrontation was so serious in the latter part of the Ford administration that Israel linked Iran's nuclear program to the Shah's support for the Kurds under the signing of the Algiers Agreement. And in fact, the issue was raised at a meeting between Israeli officials and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. and Kissinger was put under pressure to cut off American nuclear relations with Iran because of the Shah's decision to sign the Algiers Accord with Iraq. Because in Israeli strategy, the main purpose of Iran was to exert pressure on Saddam Hussein and to serve as a decoy for the Israelis. And the issue came up in the context of Iran's strategic relationship with South Africa and Israel on the nuclear issue as well. In fact, Israel offered nuclear weapons to Iran under the Shah, and the Shah turned them down flat, saying that he was collaborating with other countries. Later on, there was a nuclear weapons program on which Iran and Israel collaborated until the dying days of the Shah's administration. So basically, what I say to you is that the entire thesis that the United States approved of the Iranian nuclear program under the Shah has to be seen in the context of that period. The United States, in fact, exerted a tremendous amount of pressure on the Shah in 1977-78 under the Carter administration to sign the agreement, and the pressure was actually quite consistent with the policy that the president was pursuing at the time, which was also aimed at pressurizing countries like West Germany to cut off their relations with countries like Brazil. So in that context, the entire thesis that the Shah's nuclear program and the Islamic Republic's nuclear program was somehow strategically distinct from either the Israeli point of view or even from the American point of view is quite fallacious, because given the documentary track record and the documentary trail, the paper trail, that shows that the United States exerted a massive amount of pressure on the Shah on this issue, which was also occurring at the same time that there were disputes over the oil price issue. Anyway, I thought I'd just point that out.
Thank you, Babak. So, defend yourself.
Right.
No, but also address the Danielle's question.
Well, I'll start with the most recent. Yeah, I mean, I cover obviously this in my book at great length. I don't argue that they're strategically distinct. I mean, I think you've misunderstood my thesis. I'm talking about what the program was used for ideologically almost by the regime. And for the Shah, as I've said, very much, it was very much an idea of Iran as Western, as like its Western role models. I don't see how that means I'm saying that America and Iran didn't have serious problems. Obviously they did, as I said, I detailed them at length, obviously with Carter and everything. And I spoke to many people who were in the meetings with Henry Kissinger. So I think you may have misconstrued my thesis. I'm merely sort of talking about what the project in itself means to Iran and how this has changed over time and what this says about the changing nature of the Iranian state, which I think does hold up.
Very briefly, regarding nuclear weapons in general, I don't profess to know whether Iran has made the decision to go for nuclear weapons. However, it is, at the time of speaking, still a member of the NPT. It has to either violate the NPT or come out of the NPT in order to achieve what you were saying, India and Pakistan's nuclear weapons capability. And the debate on nuclear weapons, the open debate, is still very scarce in Iran. I just remember one instance in which it flared up in 2006 when Rafsanjani released a famous letter that Mohsen Rezai, the IRGC commander, wrote to Khomeini, and there it made a very fleeting appearance. It wasn't the sort of detailed discussion that many think it was. It made a fleeting appearance that casually sort of Mohsen Rezai says that we also need nuclear weapons in order to carry on the war struggle against Iraq. And we won't have them before, I think, 1992, so that was the reason why it wasn't possible to carry on with the war in 1988, and the ceasefire was agreed upon. So I think there would be, before Iran coming out of the NPT, there would be a considerable increase in the internal debate on nuclear weapons, far more than what we can see right now.
So in a nutshell, yeah, Iran has a right to exist. They have a right to defend themselves, but they gave up the right to nuclear weapons when they signed the NPT, and they haven't made any internal decision to change that, although they have this nuclear hedging strategy.
We have the Supreme Leader's fatwas on nuclear weapons, and that I leave to the analysis of people who work on fatwas.
And to answer Danielle's question about confidence building, what could we do now? You know, the diplomatic effort this summer was an effort at confidence building. The negotiating partners of Iran set aside for the time being the fundamental question of enrichment at the lower levels and addressed enrichment at the 20% level, and thought that if we could deal with the 20% this would build some confidence. If it could also stop the work at Fordo, which was causing so much anxiety. Those discussions didn't get very far. Julian Borger, I don't know if he's here, he was signed up, wrote a very interesting article last week in The Guardian saying that there is a revived effort to look again at what could be done with a more bold strategy of some concessions that Iran would have to make concessions itself, but maybe Iran, actually Julian didn't say this, but I think if Iran were to get some concessions in the form of some sanctions relief, Iran might have to give up more than it had originally been asked for this summer because the program has advanced. We're going to take a few more minutes because we started a little bit late, and I got three people, Paul Ingram, Baria, and Lady Kennett. So right up in the front here. And if anybody wants to leave, we won't feel insulted because we said 1 hour.
So, Pauline from Mason, I'm pretty convinced by the thesis.
Give the mic.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. I'm pretty convinced by the thesis that this is all wrapped up in the modernity issue. I wanted to highlight another issue which you didn't raise, but which backs up the point and answers the point about why the Europeans were not involved, I think, in the 1990s and in the Bashir project, and that's the Eurodif problem that went on for years, and of course was a scar on the Iranian perspective. Now, I wonder, given that the Iranians have linked their nuclear program so intimately with its concept of modernity and move into challenging the Western dominance in the region, whether there are ways and means of trying to de-link those two moving forward, and rather than to say you cannot have a nuclear program, rather for us to try and work together to move away from the concept that nuclear programs are indeed a measure of modernity, and that there may be other ways of doing this, such as renewable programs, which are far more appropriate to Iran's energy choices than nuclear programs would be.
Absolutely. Baria Alamuddin from Al Hayat.
Thank you for introducing me, Mark. I'm interested in this idea of the complexes of Iran that the world has to understand and sort of take notice of and indeed oblige. Indeed, recently we've seen Iran getting bolder and bolder. We have seen Iran, and we all understand that they need to, that their need and their desire to expand in the region, threatening countries like Lebanon, Bahrain, Yemen, etc., etc., etc. So I think you understand where I'm coming from. My point here is Iran trying to hold all these things I've been mentioning to indeed let the world know that either it's nuclear weapon or actually it threatens the security of the whole area? Is this trying to be a sort of tit for tat, or is it you give me this, I give you that? Or what is Iran trying to do exactly? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And the final question, Elizabeth, Lady Kennett.
Elizabeth Kennett, alias Elizabeth Young. The most recent development is the move into cyber war in this connection, begun by President Bush together with the Israelis with Stuxnet and more recently Olympic Games. Iran has now participated also by apparently hacking into Saudi's Aramco and also into some American banking systems. Where is all this going to lead?
Siavush, why don't you comment first of all, and then we'll let David have the last word.
A few comments on some of these themes. I think that part of the chaos I described within the Iranian political system has to do with the fact that many of these bodies do not yet have an experience in dealing with crises of this level. The Supreme National Security Council was created in 1989, not even in 1979. And this is its first major crisis it's basically handling. So they are sort of making their own rules as they move on. And this, for example, this Natanz, as Ronnie describes it, it shows you how these different bodies were not even in proper communication with each other. The Atomic Energy Agency was acting in a way that the other bodies did not have information about. And then we have completely unprecedented decisions even from the Shia point of view. The fatwa I mentioned by Ayatollah Khamenei. You'll be hard-pressed to find any Shia Marjai Taqlid which emits a fatwa on nuclear energy of any variety, nuclear weapons, energy, or anything. And you have to bear in mind that this has put the Islamic Republic, and the fatwa could be considered as a legitimate piece of document, legitimate document if you want. But again, the point is that this is all uncharted territory from a variety of perspectives, both from the fact of state bodies which are brand new, they don't have the experience of decades of handling of national security or international affairs, the lack of coordination, the fact that the nuclear program became a hot political issue around a decade ago, and therefore it is still being jostled around by the various governments. And in my book on the Iranian presidency, I'm describing how Khatami pulled himself out of the nuclear program in 2003. He just delegated it over to Rouhani. So this is one of the reasons why interpreting Iran's decisions is a bit difficult. And we are not yet, I think, at a stage where the state bodies have engaged in the final division of political labor regarding the Iranian nuclear program. And this is why, gauging what Iran really wants to do with this nuclear program and how it wants to use it as a springboard for its regional ambitions and other things is a bit difficult.
I'd just like to say, I also don't think that, I'm not talking about obliging Iran's neuroses I'm just saying we must understand them, regardless of anything else. I mean, the Islamic Republic is a deeply unpleasant regime, and let's hope that it ends sooner rather than later. But we are negotiating with these people, whether we like it or not, and we have to continue. So I do believe it is worth trying to understand as much as possible, as much as you can ever understand the opaqueness of what Iran does, as much as possible, and what drives them.
Thank you, David. I think we'll call it a day there. Elizabeth, we'll have to have another session on cyber and maybe other forms of covert action. If you could join me in thanking David and Siavush, and thank you very much.